topic of our next presentation. And let me read you the title of the next presentation. It's called An Update from the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. And we've all seen protocols, worked with study subjects and patients for whom we felt like the research protocol was not user-friendly to the patient who ended up being a study subject in that research project. And there is a move in our country to move more towards patient-centered research. And Jean Slutsky from the PCORI, Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, is going to talk to us about that research institute. It has been funded from the Affordable Care Act. Jean is the Chief Engagement and Dissemination Officer for the Research Institute. She leads the engagement program and the growing dissemination and implementation planning efforts of that program and of the Research Institute. She also serves as PCORI's communication and serves as the director of PCORI's communication and dissemination research program. Before joining PCORI, Jean directed the Center for Outcomes and Evidence at the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. Many of us are well familiar with AHRQ's research programs and funding programs. Jean conceived and implemented the Effective Healthcare Program. That program is an integrated program of research, includes stakeholder engagement, includes research training, and then includes dissemination and implementation of comparative effectiveness research, which we'll hear a little bit more about. Jean is particularly interested in pragmatic, user-driven research and its implementation into healthcare decision-making. Jean received her baccalaureate degree from the University of Iowa, trained as a physician assistant at the University of Southern California, and received a master's in health policy from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Please welcome Jean to the podium. Thank you.
So I'm going to stand over here because I'm really short and I can't see the monitor for there. My colleague who just spoke is from Minnesota, and I'm from Iowa, so I spent a good part of my life in Iowa. But as you can see from where I've traveled since then, it was a quest to get away from snow, cold, and saying eggs instead of eggs. But so I do know about Minnesota. And for those of you who are not familiar with Iowans and Minnesotans, there's a long-going joke about which state is better. Enough said. So having spent a long time in research, working in the federal funding agency and now in a non-for-profit funding agency, I have to say I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. I guess I should say, I guess that's good, but nonetheless, no conflicts. So today I'm going to talk about evidence-based information on healthcare and a little background information about that. I'm also going to spend some time talking about comparative effectiveness research as a discipline and the difference and similarities between patient-centered outcomes research, and then the Institute itself, which has just reached its 5th year of existence. And then I'm going to close out talking about engagement in research. And the reason I'm going to talk about that is because that was one of the reasons PCORI was created. And just before I get started, can those of you who are familiar with PCORI or even know about it raise your hands for me? Okay, thanks. So when we talk about clinical evidence, at least in the research worlds that I work in, we're talking about valid data about the outcomes experienced by patients who receive medical care. So the population is well defined, the clinical interventions are well defined, and we have information about the most important outcomes, both benefits and harms, so a balance of benefits and harms. And the research area that I'm going to be talking about today is effectiveness research, not efficacy research. So we're not talking about discovery, we're talking about implementation of promising research interventions into real-world settings and patients who don't look like those patients that are in very tightly controlled trials. So comparative effectiveness research, which got its beginning in the early 2000s, focuses on the choices that people make about the options for managing a condition or disease. So these are decisions that are made in everyday illnesses and conditions for themselves or their patients or their families, children. And comparative effectiveness research is distinguished by comparing the benefits, harms, and harms associated with each option. So Russ Glasgow is an implementation scientist at the university at Kaiser and University of Colorado in this neck of the woods, and he has said interventions that are efficacious under highly specific set of circumstances often fail to replicate across a wide variety of settings, conditions, and patients. And the most common thing that I can think about, and I use sort of as a poster child, is there's a technique called carotid endarterectomy, where the studies showed that patients that had an occlusion in their carotid artery of a certain percentage did extremely well when they had a surgical technique in the carotid artery that took out that section of the artery that had an occlusion. When it was applied in real-world settings and in patients who had a lesser degree of occlusion and in surgeons who hadn't done the technique as often as the surgeons in the clinical trials, and in hospitals where they didn't have the highly skilled research teams or surgical teams, patients started dying at a much higher rate than they did in the clinical studies. And in fact, it became a real clinical issue that these patients who had surgical intervention rather than aggressive medical therapy started having strokes, dying on the operating table. So that's an example where something may work in a very specific set of patients, but applied more broadly may have unintended consequences. One of my, I have to attribute this to one of my staff members who created this out of a talk that I used to give about user-driven research. And so when we talk about evidence-based medicine, what we really want is the decision maker looking through the lens of research to make decisions. So making decisions on what care to provide, what care to pay for, based on evidence rather than this is the bottom line financially. And then comparative effectiveness research is the researcher looking through the lens of the decision maker. So decision makers can't use research findings if the questions that the researchers are investigating aren't relevant to those clinicians and patients and families who have to make those decisions. So when we talk about patient-centered outcomes research, really what we're talking about is a model for conducting research that addresses comparative effectiveness questions. And it has the following characteristics. It actively engages patients and other stakeholders throughout the research process. And this is not just a perfunctory engagement. This is identifying the decisional dilemmas that patients and caregivers have, looking at the relevant health outcomes, what research protocols will reach those health outcomes, where's the best place to recruit patients into studies, and how do you communicate those findings back to the communities that participated in the studies. And also, one of the unique things about patient-centered outcomes research and comparative effectiveness research is it looks at populations that are often understudied in traditional research. So often clinical trials will exclude patients at different ages at different ends of the age spectrum, if they have chronic conditions, if they live in rural areas, or had limited access to care. So about the patient-centered outcomes research, this is an independent research agency that was created by Congress in 2010, and it has a very unique authorizing legislation in the sense that it has a board of governors that's 21 members, and the types of individuals or constituents that are reflected on the board of governors is actually mandated in legislation. So I talk about it like Noah's Ark because there are 2 patients, 2 researchers, 2 life sciences, but it really is reflective of all the decision makers in the healthcare arena. We fund clinical comparative effectiveness research that engages stakeholders and patients throughout the process and really seeks to answer real-world questions about healthcare decisions that need to be made under circumstances and concerns that are relevant to clinicians and patients. PCORI has a very broad mandate. I've highlighted in blue those words from the legislation that I think are really important to assist patients, clinicians, purchasers, and policymakers in making informed healthcare decisions, as well as the dissemination of research findings. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later because the legislation actually is very deliberate about getting those research findings out quickly. So the Board of Governors who had to create this organization out of nothing, there was no building, there were no staff, there was no executive director, just a Board of Governors. They set about hiring an executive director, getting a building, hiring staff, and creating a mission statement. And this mission statement is reflective of the legislation, and again you'll see research guided by patients, caregivers, and the broader healthcare community. So there are 3 strategic goals for the organization. One is to increase the quantity, quality, and timeliness of useful, trustworthy research, to speed the implementation and the use of the research, and then finally to influence the research funded by others to be more patient-centered. And what we're seeing now is a larger discussion among the research community, drug development, device development, about patient centricity and the inclusion of patients in this type of research. So how are we different from NIH, AHRQ, other funding agencies? So we fund research specifically on which care options work for whom and under which circumstances. We focus on answering questions that are important to patients and other stakeholders, including those clinicians who care for them. We aim to produce evidence that can be easily applied in real-world settings. So the studies mimic how care is delivered. And we engage patients, caregivers, and clinicians, insurers, employers, and other stakeholders throughout the research process. We do this in a very laborious manner, and we require that the researchers we fund do this. And I often refer to PCORI as the People's Research Institute because of this. That's not in the legislation. So one of the things I wanted to talk about, I said a few minutes ago, is the authorizers, or Congress, when they authorized PCORI, felt very strongly that there was a huge lag time between when research was conducted and when those research findings get out to the public. And our previous speaker alluded to the fact that academic researchers don't often collaborate and share research results, and that can actually delay research findings getting out to those who need it. So the legislation says that no later than 90 days after the conduct or receipt of the findings, they need to be made available to clinicians, patients, and the general public, and it needs to be made comprehensible and useful to patients and providers for healthcare decisions. What's important about this is the study findings need to include considerations specific to certain subpopulations, risk factors and comorbidities, and talk about the process and methods, including conflicts of interest in the research, and include limitations and further research needed. And this is unique. I can't think of any other funding agency that has this requirement. We're in the process of implementing a way of doing this that has been through 2 public comment periods, and this will undoubtedly have an impact on how research findings get out to the public, including those who participate in the clinical studies that PCORI funds. So when we talk about patient-centered outcomes research and what research PCORI funds, we do have a unique set of funding priorities. So we pay particular attention to conditions that affect a large number of patients across a range of populations, and conditions that place a heavy burden on individuals, families, specific populations, and society, populations that are understudied, and rare conditions and diseases which are often very difficult to study because there's small numbers of patients. We pay particular attention to specific populations that have traditionally been understudied in clinical research, and we do this in ways that we hope will increase the evidence about populations that may have had to rely on studies that were done in populations that didn't look like them, and generalizability and applicability of those findings were difficult to do. I wanted to spend just a little bit of time, because of the audience we have here, talking about what are called pragmatic clinical studies. How many of you have heard that term, pragmatic clinical studies? Okay, it's a term that started in the early 2000s when the Institute of Medicine created a roundtable that looked at clinical trials and their suitability to being patient-centric and giving healthcare decision makers the tools they needed to make decisions. Pragmatic clinical studies are those types of studies that take place under conditions that are not as tightly controlled as traditional regulatory studies or placebo-controlled trials. So these generally compare 2 or more options for prevention, diagnosis, treatment, or management of a disease or condition. It addresses critical clinical choices faced by patients, caregivers, and clinicians and systems, and they're often conducted in real-world settings, so community hospitals, non-academic settings, primary care offices, and they're often large, usually less complex protocols than traditional trials, so they generally don't have more than 3 aims. The reason they're very large is because they're not tightly controlled, so the effect size is really hard to show. And they have topics of special interest from stakeholders. And this can include other funding agencies that have identified research gaps but are unable to fund them. We have just started these cycles of funding cycles. So we have 6 to 9 anticipated. The availability of funding per cycle is up to 50 million. Is that 50 million? 90 million, sorry. The maximum project duration is 5 years, and the maximum direct cost is 10 million or 15 million in total costs. We first issued the funding announcement for the Pragmatic Clinical Studies program in February 2014. The first funded projects were announced in mid-2015. We use a competitive level of intent so that we don't have someone submit a big application if they've missed the mark, if you've identified a topic that really isn't in our wheelhouse. The next LOI deadline will be in the fall of 2015. We have a new funding announcement that will be coming out in October, so stay tuned if you're interested. And the emphasis is on priority clinical topics that are laid out in the funding announcement. And we also do look at investigator-initiated topics, but the justification for the decisional dilemma has to be well described. We expect to fund about 20 of these, possibly more, in 2015 to 2016. So just to reiterate, pragmatic clinical studies are intended to provide information that can be directly adopted by healthcare decision makers. They're mostly conducted in routine clinical settings. They're large because the expected differences in effectiveness may be small, yet important or different in patient subgroups. They're less intrusive to routine clinical practice. So for example, we look carefully at how well the protocols align with the patients coming to get clinical care. So don't bring the patient back just for one blood test. Try to do all the data collection at one clinical visit so you don't make it difficult for either the patient or their family to participate in a study. These are sometimes called large simple trials, if you've heard that term. So why did we set up the Pragmatic Clinical Studies program? Well, again, traditional randomized controlled trials, the study sample tends to be homogeneous, highly motivated, and therefore more adherent populations, and relatively free of comorbid conditions. And those patient populations don't look like any of us in this room. Research tends to take place in specialized research settings where you would get optimal adherence to standards of care. And research protocols are often strict and do not represent typical clinical practice where decisions have to be made outside of protocols and documented. So again, to reiterate, these answer practical, real-world comparative effectiveness research questions. They assess whether two or more options differ in effectiveness, not efficacy, when administered in real life. And the project is conducted in a clinical setting that is as close to possible to a real-world setting where a patient would receive care. The methodological approach, including study design, outcome measures, and follow-up, is as simple as possible without sacrificing scientific rigor. And studies must have an impact. This is very important to PCORI. We're at the distal end of the research continuum, so the focus on a CER question that is important to patients and decision makers is vitally important and has to be documented. These studies need to address an evidence gap that has been substantiated by existing rigorously conducted systematic reviews or specifically emphasized by a professional society's evidence-based clinical practice guideline. Endorsement by relevant patient organizations, clinician organizations, payer, purchaser consortia, and/or life science industry representation as being a critical question, one that, if adequately answered, would substantially change practice and improve clinical decision-making. So I wanted to talk about some projects that are outside of PCORI's priorities, both by legislation and the decision of the board. PCORI does not do cost-effectiveness analyses or studies that primarily address costs of care as an outcome. We don't fund studies that develop new methods of measurement or development. We don't fund studies of efficacy of unproven treatments, and we don't do national history studies. We also work to improve research methodology. So the legislation that authorizes PCORI mandated a methodology committee and mandated that they develop methodology standards which have been adopted by the Board of Governors. These methodological standards form a floor of standards that need to be adhered to by all applicants to PCORI, and these are the areas in which the standards exist. So these are some of the examples of the standards. For example, engage people representing the population of interest and other relevant stakeholders in ways that are appropriate and necessary in a given research context. The last one, use validated methods to deal with missing data that properly account for statistical uncertainty due to missingness. So as you can see, these are not out of the norm. These are good practice in clinical studies. So I want to close by talking about engagement and engaging individuals and communities. And the reason I want to talk about that because this has been a big hurdle for applicants to PCORI because we not only talk the talk, but we walk the walk. We have merit review panels that include patients and other stakeholders as well as statistical reviewers, so an applicant won't be successful at PCORI unless they have a very engaged methodology of doing research. So the philosophy of PCORI and PCORI's Board of Governors to engage is to influence research, to be patient-centered and useful, and to establish trust and a sense of legitimacy in the research findings, and then to encourage the successful update and trust in the research findings as they come out. And this is just a diagram that shows patient involvement at PCORI. They're involved at the very beginning in terms of setting priorities for the topics that we fund. We do fund targeted research along with the Pragmatic clinical studies, and so we actually bring in stakeholders, including patients and families, to talk about their research priorities, the questions that they have. Patients are involved in the design and conduct of a study, as well as reviewing proposals and then selecting topics. We actually have guidance on how to compensate stakeholders, in particular patients and other partners in the research process. So oftentimes PCORI research has a co-PI who's a patient or another stakeholder. They're also part of advisory panels that oversee the conduct of a study, steering committees, and so forth. So we have spent some time evaluating PCORI's research done differently. We look at how well we're doing covering our current activities. Are we moving forward toward our goals? And what is the effect of being so patient-centered and having so much engagement? And is the research we fund ultimately having a positive impact on health decisions, the quality of health care, and health outcomes? So we see ourselves as a learning organization and have begun the first round of evaluation. So the objectives for measuring engagement and its impact in the work that PCORI does is to describe engagement on PCORI-funded projects, to evaluate its impact, and to inform our future funding requirements with regard to engagement, and to guide current awardees, future applicants, and others interested in patient-centered outcomes research, and to support progress, project progress based on learnings. So we want this to be successful. This isn't intended to be a gotcha situation. If applicants are having trouble with team science, working with multidisciplinary teams, patients and other stakeholders, we want to help them. So we've developed processes, procedures, and actually personnel called engagement officers who work directly with successful applicants. So we've asked qualitative research questions on different successful PIs' engagement strategies, what their barriers and facilitators were, what they felt the impact of engagement was, what the differences are by respondent type. So do patient partners feel differently than their research partners? And the questionnaire asked for improvement. So how can we do better? So we got a lot of robust qualitative comments on lots of things. And none of these will be surprising to you. There were some foundational comments on how IRBs view patient participation as partners. And I want to emphasize that patient partners are not patients that are enrolled in the study. So IRBs sometimes look at this as coercive. Compensation for stakeholders that are not actual researchers. How do you initiate and maintain the partnerships once the funding ends? How do you communicate among diverse partners? So how do researchers communicate to patients and other stakeholders? How do you capture and use different perspectives, particularly around study design, recruitment, and retention? One of the things we've learned is many projects have been saved by patient comments on recruitment and retention, telling a PI that you will never ever be able to get a patient to agree to be recruited into a study if you ask them at this stage in the clinical encounter. They also are very effective in helping to give advice to the researcher on how best to help retain patients in a study. And so this has been very positive for many of our investigators. How do you ensure the influence over study design? How do you train and share information amongst applicants? And then what are the impacts beyond the actual project, so going into dissemination and implementation? So turning information into action, one of the things that is important is in the application phase, what are the expectations about application success and compensation? Research relationships, in-person meetings, technology supports, and protected time. These are things that are all important to the researchers and the applicants. They told us that the opportunities for expanding stakeholder relationships are limited, and they need to have financial and technical supports to do this. Team training. We heard this over and over again. Inclusiveness, managing groups, communicating expectations, incorporating input, and then facilitation of sharings and learnings across different research projects. So I'm going to end here, which will make the timekeeper very happy. Patient-centered outcomes research provides relevant information to help patients and providers choose among alternative clinical strategies. This is a different type of research. Applicants for funding should engage patients and stakeholders in identifying questions, decisional dilemmas, and defining important outcomes. And projects should directly address important clinical comparisons and examine meaningful outcomes. And the standards that were developed by the Methodology Committee and adopted by the board guide best practices for planning, conducting, and reporting research. And some conclusions about engagement. The challenges during the application phase include uncertainty about the viability of partnerships. The impact on study design ranged from none to major, but many reported to us that it was transformative. Recruitment methods are an important area of engagement impact. Many studies fail simply on recruitment issues alone. Training needs were defined by most respondents, and early evidence of the impact of engagement across stages of research have been remarkable. So thank you.